But
Yeah.
I want to get back to the vaccines because your book is brilliant. It really goes into some eye-opening components that aren't typically discussed. And there's so many places we can start, but why don't we? I mean, we could talk about polio, which I mean, polio is typically used, and Suzanne recognizes too in her book "Dissolving Illusions" that um, that is polio is pretty much the main one in smallpox that the vaccine advocates use to defend their position. And
Right.
I had never heard of the toxic component environmentally that were correlated about the same times of the epidemics of polio that we had in the early 20th century and then prior to World War II. So why don't you expand on that? Because it really is eye-opening and very easy and simple to explain to friends and relatives.
Yeah, and it's certainly the most controversial of the things I wrote about, or one of them in the book. So it's an interesting place to start. But obviously, whenever you get into this, there's the what I call the "hey, wait a minute" moments,
Mhm.
where you're going along and like everybody thinks a certain thing, and then something happens to present you with a fact or an observation, and then everybody says to themselves, or maybe not everybody, hey, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense to what my usual worldview is. Now, some of us, I think, are trained, or I would like to say schooled, to ignore those moments. So that can't be because I know my first grade teacher told me and everybody else believes it, and the last thing I want to do is go against this. And then sometimes there's the hey, wait a minute moments where you just, for whatever reason, feel compelled to follow. So here we go with polio. So there's this virus that's an enterovirus, meaning it lives in our GI tract, and it's supposedly been around for millennia, thousands of years, and yet, with very few exceptions, there's no recorded cases of polio anywhere in any medical literature until the late 1800s. There was some epidemic or outbreak in Europe, and then there was a small outbreak in Vermont. So the first question one needs to ask oneself is, so what happened there? Why did it change? What happened to the virus? Did it mutate? Did humans change in some way? Or was some other cofactor involved? So it turns out that in both those places, there was the introduction of arsenic-based insecticides used to spray for gypsy moths, first in Europe and then in Vermont. And it was well known that this insecticide, this arsenic-based insecticide, causes paralysis in cattle. And eventually they discovered that the mechanism of action of this arsenic-based chemical is on the anterior horn cells of the nervous system, the very part of the nervous system that polio is said to affect. So then over time, this arsenic-based chemical became more and more widespread, and we start seeing sporadic cases of polio, in different parts of the world and the US. And then there comes in the mid 1915 to 1918, pretty much a huge increase of the cases of polio concentrated on the eastern seaboard, particularly in Long Island. And so this provoked a lot of consternation and a lot of people saying, don't go to the beach and don't do this, and articles in newspapers about why this was happening. And there's a very good website on this called The Age of Autism, where a Pulitzer Prize winning newspaper editor named Dan Olmsted did massive amount of research on this. And what he found out was that particularly the place in Long Island off near New York City was the first place to introduce sugar that was grown on Hawaiian sugar plantations that used a very particular form of arsenic to essentially accomplish weed control. Now, the way that came about was the sugar industry, which was mainly centered in Cuba and Hawaii, was failing because they had no way to control their weeds, and it was a huge undertaking with labor and et cetera to manage the sugar, and they were losing money. And then this one guy, I don't remember his name, developed this arsenic-based way to control weeds. And besides the fact that it decimated their environment, it made the growing of sugarcane more profitable. And it was that sugarcane which was processed and sent first to New York City and then Baltimore and Boston, the exact places where these outbreaks of polio came about. It's also interesting that when he looked at the cases, they were often centered on neighborhoods that were right near sugar processing factories, and even very particular candy stores that were getting sugar from these Hawaiian arsenic-laced, shipments of sugar. And it turns out that the arsenic does concentrate in the sugar. So basically, it looked like that the story is not pure in mutated virus or change in the people. That at least that there's a cofactor here, which is in order for the virus to cause disease, in order for there to be paralytic polio, you first have to have some negative effect on the anterior horn cells, which came through arsenic. Now, it's very interesting when you read back that there was actually a proof of that the polio virus caused polio. It was done somewhere in the early part of the century. These researchers...
the 20th century or the 21st?
20th century.
Okay.
I think it was like 1914 or so.
Okay.
There was some children who died of paralytic disease, and they couldn't find an animal model to infect that would get polio. Apparently, animals don't get polio. So they took right. So they took they took some cerebrospinal fluid from these children who died of paralysis. They had the monkeys, I think they were rhesus monkeys, eat it and nothing happened. And then they injected it intramuscular and nothing happened. And then they injected it right into the cerebrospinal fluid of the monkeys. They basically did a craniotomy, injected it into their brain. This was unpurified cerebrospinal fluid from a child who died of paralysis. They injected that into the brains of these monkeys. One monkey died and the other got paralyzed. And they said, aha, we've proven that there's a viral cause of paralytic polio. Now, that's without any purification of the virus. And God knows really what these children died of. And injecting the cerebrospinal fluid into the brain of a monkey and seeing that the monkey has a problem when you don't know why the child died and you didn't purify the virus, that's a joke. So that is still to this day considered the experimental proof that polio is a transmissible disease caused by a virus. So we go on from there, and then polio, for some unexplained reason, sort of wanes. And this probably because the arsenic use, as they discovered in Hawaii, was poisoning all the the fish and all the workers and everything else. So they cut down in the use, so there was less polio, less arsenic in the sugar. As time went on, then, as we all remember, another miracle chemical got not invented, because it was invented in the late 1900s, I think, but became in widespread use. And it was generally used extensively in the summers. And I don't know about you, Joe, but I'm old enough to remember running behind these sprayers on the ball fields as they sprayed out this sweet-smelling gas that was meant to kill mosquitoes. And as we all know, that was DDT.
Yeah, they're still doing it to this day, but not DDT, other chemicals that are maybe every bit as pernicious.
Yes. But the difference, in a way, is DDT, like arsenic, has a particular affinity for the anterior horn cells of the nervous system, which, you know, essentially control the motor neurons or the movement nerves. So you started seeing, and if you see a graph of the DDT spraying in the summer with the polio, which also came in the summer, they're basically identical. So the more spraying, the more polio. Then there was all kinds of congressional hearings on whether polio was really a virus, and I have testimony after testimony from people saying this is not a virus, this is a neurochemical intoxication, essentially a poisoning. They didn't really know what it was. They eventually did a study of an epidemic in Detroit, which interestingly was where I grew up. And they were able to identify the virus in the children who died of paralytic polio in exactly 51% of the cases, which means in 49% of the cases, the children who died of polio had no evidence of any viral infection, which then completely abandons so-called Koch's postulates that if you have a viral disease and you say this is the reason they died, every single person with that disease should have evidence of the virus, when in fact the biggest study ever shows that it was 51%. Anyways, at some point then in the early 60s, Rachel Carson wrote the book Silent Spring. DDT got stopped being used, at least in this country. That was sort of around the exact same time that the polio epidemic ended. We no longer use arsenic on the fields, and we basically exported it to other countries and used other, you know, insecticides and other chemicals that have a different pathological effect. And so we don't see paralytic polio anymore.
Yeah, you know, that's really fascinating because I was never previously aware that the arsenic was a component of the sugar. I mean, I had certainly heard and read the stories of sugar, and that seemed to make a lot of sense as it would suppress the immune system, but it would, you know, there's a lot of people eat sugar and they don't come down with polio. So
Exactly.
it does make sense that there was an additional variable that it really massively increased the toxicity to it.
But you know, it's interesting because Dan Olmsted has a whole series, and anybody who's really interested in this, I would go to the Age of Autism website. And, you know, there was public health article after public health article telling children and families on the Eastern Seaboard, don't eat sugar, sugar is bad for you. And, you know, these epidemics were clustered around candy stores. But like you said, neither of us think sugar is very good for you. But it didn't cause paralytic polio, not by itself. It's, you know, not good for you, but you need some other variable, some other cofactor.
Yeah, it certainly